Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you very much again for tuning in. This is a screencast-o-matic presentation and recording for the part of the lesson that has us looking at the 6 myths about slavery. Now, so far in this class for world cultures, we haven't really talked about the American experience. However, when we mention slavery in Africa, of course, we have to talk about the United States and its role in triangular trade. So please listen carefully to the following reading. You can follow along on the hard copy text that's on Google Classroom or just listen here and answer the key concept questions just by filling in the chart about the common myths that people might have about slavery as an institution. So let's go ahead and get started. And remember, you can replay any part of this presentation that you might need for clarity later on. So the 6 myths about slavery. 400 years after enslaved Africans were first brought to Virginia, many people still don't fully understand American slavery. Here's what we often get wrong. So in 1619, a ship docked in Virginia, changing the course of history, and on board were some 20 people who'd been captured in southwestern Africa and forced to make the perilous journey across the Atlantic to Jamestown, where they were sold and likely put to work in tobacco fields. They were the first enslaved Africans brought to the English colonies that would become the United States. So captive Africans had already begun living in the Americas, transported mainly by the Portuguese and the Spanish, but many historians point to the ship's arrival 400 years ago as one of the most consequential moments in history. By the end of transatlantic slave trade in the early 1800s, about 12.5 million men, women, and children would be taken from their homes in Africa, shackled in chains, herded onto ships, and bound to the New World. So the transatlantic slave trade gave birth to the new form of slavery, one that was based on race, was for life, and was passed down from parent to child. This brutal system of forced labor would propel the colonial economy and fuel the growth of the U.S. into the wealthiest nation in the world. Yet despite its impact, many myths about slavery persist. Here are 6 commonly held misconceptions and the truth about what really happened. So, let's go to the first one here. Myth: enslaved people rarely fought back. The truth: in August 1831, a group of about 70 enslaved and free black people, led by an enslaved preacher named Nat Turner, revolted in Southampton, Virginia, killing more than 55 white people. Local militia put down the uprising and imprisoned and killed most of the rebels. In the days following the revolt, white mobs murdered an additional 200 enslaved people, many of whom had nothing to do with it. So Nat Turner's rebellion was just one of the many that took place during American slavery. But because the penalty for seeking freedom, either by running away or by rebelling, was often death, most enslaved people resisted in subtler ways. They secretly learned to read and write through education. It was legal for them. They sabotaged equipment to slow the unrelenting pace of labor that was expected. They amassed extra food and clothes because they were given barely enough to survive, and they formed families, despite laws that denied them the legal right to marry. So enslaved people always resisted, says Hassan Kwame Jeffries, a history professor at Ohio State University, in ways that are both seen and unseen. Here's another myth. Not all enslaved people were treated badly. Here's the truth. While some slaveholders later maintained that they treated the people that they enslaved, quote, like family, and treatment did vary from place to place, all enslaved people suffered from violence, whether physical or psychological or both. Enslaved people were often whipped mercilessly, branded, shackled, and even those who didn't face this cruelty still encountered other forms of abuse, whether it was rape, having their family members taken from them and sold like livestock, being forced to do back-breaking labor or for no pay, and being denied the right to move freely, assemble in groups, and learn to read and write. Historians say all slaveholders ultimately ruled using some methods of violence. This is a violent system of controlling people from life to death, says Jeffries. The only way it was possible for the institution of slavery to exist is because people were constantly resisting. It was through violence and threat of violence. Perhaps nothing is more telling about the brutality of the slavery as an institution than the fact that so many enslaved people attempted to run away. An estimated 100,000 enslaved people escaped to freedom via the Underground Railroad between 1810 and 1850. Countless more tried but were caught and beaten and or killed. Next, slavery existed only in the South. The truth? Though we often think of slavery as, quote, a Southern thing, end quote, it existed in all 13 colonies at some point before the Revolutionary War. Enslaved people in the North were forced to toil on farms and in homes and help build the early cities of Boston and New York, work on the docks, and do skilled labor, such as blacksmithing and shoemaking. However, slavery in the North was never as widespread as it was in the South, which became increasingly reliant on cotton plantations. At the time of the American Revolution, fewer than 10% of 500,000 enslaved people in the 13 colonies lived in the north of the Mason-Dixon line. But by 1804, all northern states voted to abolish slavery, but Northern whites continued to profit from slavery in the South. New England textile factories obtained their cotton from Southern plantation, banks in New York supplied loans to plantation owners, and Northern insurance companies sold them insurance policies on the people that they enslaved. As a result, many white Northerners opposed abolitionism, and even during the Civil War, thousands of them dodged the draft or abandoned the ranks of the Union Army. Next, let's go ahead to another myth here. The Civil War wasn't about slavery. Truth, just a month after Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, South Carolina became the first state to succeed, clearly stating its reason in its Declaration of Succession. Quote, the election of a man to the high office of President of the United States whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery, end quote. Slavery had been outlawed in the North, but nearly 4 million people were held in bondage in the South and in the border states. So the Southern states' economy relied on slave labor, and many white Southerners feared that the election of Lincoln, who was morally opposed to slavery, would bring about its end. Other Southern states soon followed South Carolina's lead in breaking from the Union, also citing slavery as their reason. The people of the slave-holding states are bound together, Louisiana's declaration stated, by the same necessity and determination to preserve African slavery. So after the Civil War ended in 1865, some white Southerners began maintaining that the war had not been about slavery, but about states' rights and the right of states rather than the federal government to rule themselves. But that claim has persisted to this day. However, many Confederate veterans remained adamant about the real reason for the war. I've never heard of any other cause than slavery, Confederate Commander John S. Mosby wrote in 1894. Let's go to the next myth. Lincoln freed all the enslaved people. But the truth here is this. On January 1st, 1863, about 2 years into the Civil War, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that the approximately 3.5 million enslaved people in the rebellious states are, quote, henceforth shall be free, end quote. However, the proclamation didn't apply to 500,000 enslaved people living in the states not part of the Confederacy, or to the enslaved people living in areas of the South already occupied by Union troops. In the Confederate-controlled places where most of the enslaved lived, it was rarely enforceable because the Union wasn't in charge. Nonetheless, the proclamation marked a major turning point in the war, and for Lincoln. Though slavery had been the war's fundamental cause, Lincoln's priority in going to war had been to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. But as the bloody conflict dragged on, thousands of enslaved people fled to Union-controlled areas, ultimately forcing Lincoln to sign the proclamation, and with that, the war changed a war to keep the Union together to a fight for freedom. Says Mary Elliott, a curator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. The proclamation also had a strategic effect, declaring for the first time that black men would be accepted in the Union Army and Navy. Over the next 2 years, more than 200,000 black men would serve the Union, knowing that victory meant freedom. Their efforts would help force Confederate General Robert E. Lee to surrender at Appomattox in April of 1865. And here's another myth. Forced labor ended with the 13th Amendment. But here's the truth. It's widely believed that the 13th Amendment, ratified shortly after the Civil War ended in 1865, abolished slavery in America. However, the amendment states that slavery is unconstitutional except as a punishment for crime. After the war, the former Confederate states sought to replicate the system of forced labor they lost by passing the laws called Black Codes, which meant vagrancy, being unemployed, and other petty offenses a crime. This made it easy for them to arrest African Americans, and once in prison, these convicts could be leased out as laborers to private individuals and companies. Through convict leasing, many formerly enslaved people found themselves doing the same grueling labor and being subjugated to the same beatings and other violence as before the Civil War. Convict leasing died out by the late 1920s, replaced with the brutal prison farms and chain gangs, which continued well into the 50s. There were many other ways African Americans' lives were restricted after slavery as well. Jim Crow laws kept them segregated from whites, voting laws prevented them from casting ballots, and white supremacist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan terrorized their communities. To understand the civil rights movement and all that came after, historians say, it's important to start with the truth of how slavery began and ended in the U.S. If you don't understand slavery and its central role in America's formation, then you really can't understand the American past, says Jeffries. If you can't understand America's past, you can't understand America's present. So all these talking points here are very much so true when we look at the myths of slavery, and I think that as even world culture students, as we're focused on the rest of the world, have to look at slavery too from a both national and international perspective to see the real story of history. So once again, you are welcome to play any part of this presentation or look at the source that is there, and then you should be good to progress throughout the rest of the lesson. Thank you very much.